Like a circus performer, he was easygoing and amicable most of the time, with a wrinkled smile on a face which was filled with the footsteps of the past, though he rarely talked to anybody. He just wandered in the park like an old vagabond. Only birds gathered around him, chirping joyfully. At those times, he talked as incessantly as a gambler who's just won a lot of money. But now, after a few glasses of wine, he suddenly became thoughtful and taciturn. I sat opposite him, my left hand roaming aimlessly on the surface of the old wooden table. In my right hand, I clumsily held the glass full of crystal clear liquor, which had been in front of me since the beginning of our unexpected get-together. The old man's apartment seemed to be sinking under the aromatic tide of roasting food. The smells made my mouth water and my stomach grumbled with hunger. "Don't overcook it, sir," I said, trying to break the ice.
"Call me John."
He nodded, and his head seemed to get heavier on top of that fragile, scrawny neck.
"And don't worry about my cooking."
I glanced at the stove in the corner of the kitchen. His apartment was quite large. A cosy bedroom, a bright living room, a narrow bathroom, and a spacious dining room connected to a tiny kitchen. An immense space for an old bachelor. Suddenly, he lifted his glass towards me, saying merrily,
"Drink up, young man."
I touched my glass to his and drank a gulp of wine, then put it down again. He drained his glass, so that when he put it down it shone as if it had been polished, and exhaled noisily with pleasure. The liquor crawled and tingled in my cheeks and ears, like ants shaken out of their nest. He looked up into the square, empty space of the dining room. His eyes were wet with vague emotion. They seemed to drift to a remote corner of memory. That reminded me of the birds in the city's park. Perhaps only those birds could cheer him up, rejuvenate, revitalize, and turn him into a young man in love for the first time. "You live alone?" I threw an unprepared question into the awkward atmosphere. He remained tranquil for a moment, then shook his head as if trying to escape a heavy, dark dream.
"Of course."
He looked thoughtfully at his empty glass.
"I have no relatives other than the birds in the park. All my children."
As he mentioned the birds, his voice was soaked in emotion. I remembered the birds playing merrily around the old man, perching on his shoulders, arms, knees, and even on his old worn shoes, stretching their long, delicate necks, tilting their tiny pea-shaped heads on one side, then the other. They reminded me of joyful and anxious children, waiting for gifts from their gentle old father. The birds surround him. The bench is very old. The cloth bag, probably full of bread, lies on the bench. The tourists are busy taking pictures and collecting souvenirs. The birds embellish the city with their very presence. Jobless, they do nothing but wait for crumbs of bread offered by idle tourists.
"Well, we've known each other for almost a year now."
He changed the subject quite unexpectedly. Probably. I hesitated, trying to remember when we had first met.
"Probably what?"
he refuted, holding the half-full bottle by its neck.
"You're still young. Your memory should be good."
I looked straight into his eyes, nodding. "Sometimes there are things we must learn to forget."
"Such as?"
challenged the old man belligerently. He poured again and put the bottle down on the table, lifting up his square, wrinkled chin, his bushy grey beard. "Sad stories of the past, for example." He put the glass to his lips, sipped, exhaled like a hissing snake, then shook his head deploringly.
"The memory of human beings is so bad. You know that, don't you? Men can't be compared to the birds that I see in the park. Men learn nothing from the past. All the bitter lessons from the past are just a waste. Too bad. Too bad."
"Well, those birds remember you because you feed them every day. No big deal. Human beings are very different." I eagerly defended the chaotic species that I belonged to. What I'd heard him whisper to the birds in the park a few days ago murmured in my ears.
Hey, don't be too greedy, son. Save some for your younger brothers, sweetie. Don't eat too much, little girl. Behave yourselves, children. Hey!
And I thought I should ask him how he could tell a female from a male bird so easily. But still sinking deeply into a strange kind of suffering, he murmured painfully,
It was Auschwitz, then Treblinka, then Hiroshima, then the killing fields of Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia. Soon there'll be Korea. Human beings never learn anything. Not at all.
Suddenly, the sharp note of the fire alarm shook me. The old man stood up slowly, dragged a chair to the middle of the kitchen, climbed on it, and disconnected the wire of the alarm attached to the ceiling. The sound stopped. "That's because you overcook your food," I said, trying to calm the irregularity of my heartbeats. He pulled the chair back to its place next to the table and dragged his blurry shadow toward the oven. The grill inside glowed red in the twilight of the kitchen. He opened the oven, performed a cursory inspection with his eyes. The aroma swarmed out into the kitchen. My stomach contracted again with rude and barbaric hunger, and I remembered what he had told the birds in the park.
Behave yourselves, children.
He still stubbornly defended his children.
Never despise birds. Birds are good students. They'll never forget the lessons they've learned.
"It's all instinct, old John." I leaned back, trying to look cool and natural, so that I could discount the points old John had been trying to add to the score table of his birds in the park. "Hungry creatures will loiter in places where food's available. You feed them every day. Now, suppose that you're rude to them, shoo them away. They'll still gather around you." Paying no attention to what I said, the old man still buried himself in waves of malleable meditation and hammering words of steel, defending the birds who knew nothing but flocking to the tourists, begging for breadcrumbs.
The brain of a bird is smaller than the tip of your thumb, young man. But perhaps more than half of it is reserved for storing unforgettable lessons.
He turned off the oven and brought the tray full of roasted food to the table. I opened my eyes wide at the sight of pieces of meat, perhaps marinated with all kinds of spices, shining under the fading sheath of sunlight that peeped through the narrow window.
Human beings are hopeless. Millions of lives have been sacrificed. Those deaths left no vital lesson. The birds in the park have respect. All my children.
Again he lifted his face, rudely slashed by time, staring into empty space with a look of desperation, saturated by the regrets of a patient discovering that he has an incurable illness. Then he turned away and pensively walked toward the corner of the kitchen. His lonely gait was that of a lovelorn human being. "Wow, you cook like a professional." I pulled old John back to this world, eyeing the roasted shapes. "But where do you get these tiny chickens, old John?" Busy ransacking one cupboard after the other, he replied curtly,
Who said they're chickens?
"Young chickens. What else?"
Young man, you need to learn more.
"Like what?"
Birds. These are the birds in the park.
Immediately, I saw the carefree birds that always gathered round the old man, waiting patiently for their tiny crumbs of bread. Are you sure, old John?" He came back to the table with a jar of red sauce.
Why would I lie to you? These are birds from the city park.
"Your children?"
So what?
He dropped heavily on the chair, blinking rapidly, as if his eyes were clouded by dust.
We have to eat, don't we?
"But I thought you loved those birds more than anything in the world."
Correct. Come on, eat your meal while it's hot, young man.
He used the fork to toss an overcooked bird onto my dish, nodding with satisfaction.
Delicious, huh?
Curiosity clung to my mind like sticky cobwebs. How did you catch them? Biting crunchily into a roasted bird, he replied,
Quite easy. A loaf of bread, a routine. Every day. Show them your true love. Be nice, like a daycare professional. The birds surround you. Look around carefully. If nobody's watching, grasp one, twist and break its neck, shove it into the cloth bag. Act cool.
He stopped talking to pull a thin bone from the scrawny leg of the innocent bird and dropped it on the table. Aren't you afraid of being seen by other people, old John?
I certainly am. But that's not as scary as being seen by the birds themselves.
I imagined the horrible scenes of people being attacked by birds, once in a while shown on TV. He licked his lips with pleasure.
One bird seeing you won't be much of a problem. But if many of them see you doing that, you'll be a loser. The birds might have frail memories, much more fragile than those of human beings, but they never forget lessons of life and death. Eat your meal up, young man. You're not allergic to birds, are you?
Not at all. I shook my head, toying awkwardly with the fork and the shining golden thigh of the unlucky bird.
Then eat up. Roasted birds are the best.
I pierced the thigh with my fork, tremblingly brought it to my mouth. If only old John wouldn't call the birds my children. How do you know?
What?
About the memory of your children.
How do I know? Let me tell you this now, then forget about it.
The old man's dry face reddened and shook spasmodically like a puppet mask whose strings had been cut.
I've been a self-employed man with that kind of profession for a long time in different parks. Make only one mistake and you're boycotted by them. They even utter strange, shrill cries as if they were blaming or reproaching you. Well, drink up, young man, and don't tell nobody.
A few days later, I went to the park to look for old John for a chat. He had no phone, so the best way to find him was to go there early in the morning. The park was quiet and deserted. Morning dews sparkled on the green carpet of grass, which was neatly bordered by the winding paved path. Flocks of birds scattered in the gleaming sunlight. Old John stood near a bench, looking as lost as an abandoned soul. The cloth bag hung from one skinny shoulder. Seeing me, he immediately woke up from his dream and walked eagerly towards me. All the birds flew away as he passed them. Waves of shrill cries, emitted by a multitude of black beaks glittering under the morning sun, filled the thin fresh air with aggression, like a tornado.
I lost my job again.
Old John's voice, full of sorrow and deprived of all traces of life, seemed to come from somewhere else.
Do you know any parks in this city other than this one, young man?